So, students, we have been discussing about the eutectoid transformation in the steels. This is one of the important transformation because most of the steels have the product of the eutectoid transformation as a perlite. In the last class I have shown you some pictures or some micrographs of perlite and discussed to you about how the transformation actually happens. Now today I am going to discuss in detail about the transformation as it happens in the steels, and also I will talk about whether we can understand something about the growth of perlite. So any phase transformation in solid state or liquid state obviously will have two stages: nucleation of the phases and the growth. So first I will discuss little bit about nucleation so that we can make a complete picture of nucleation growth connected together. Although I have discussed this in the last lecture, but let me just tell you again, there is no harm in saying second time. So as you know, the perlite has two phases. One is alpha iron, alpha actually. This contains very little amount of carbon in BCC iron, and other one is a carbide, that is known as cementite. The chemical composition of cementite is Fe3C. It has orthorhombic crystal structure, it is brittle, and basically it is an intermetallic with a compound with iron and carbon, and that is what makes the system consisting of one brittle phase and iron, because it is a BCC iron with very little of carbon. So therefore it is a ductile phase. So in perlite we have a in situ composite between a ductile phase and a brittle and hard phase, and that is what gives the steel the fascinating mechanical and physical properties. So as you know, the nucleation of the phases from the austenite or gamma phase can happen in many ways. The actual transformation is gamma going to alpha plus Fe3C as we cool down below 727 degrees Celsius. Let me tell you, this temperature can be seen different in different books. It can start with 723 degrees Celsius in some books and can go even more than 727 degrees Celsius in books. That depends upon the purity of the gamma phase. So, but does not matter, the transformation happens normally in the temperature range of 720 to 730s, and it leads to production of the two phases, formation of the two phases simultaneously, like alpha and Fe3C. Now let us suppose, obviously as I told you, that the prior gamma grains will have boundaries before it transforms to perlite. Let us suppose there are 3 gamma grains with very well defined boundaries. So it is very obvious, as we discussed in the nucleation, that nucleation of these phases to start with will always tend to happen either along the gain boundaries or in the gain corner or the edges of the gain boundaries. It can happen there because the energy involved in getting the nucleation is much lower in these sites than inside the grains. That means the nucleation barrier is low. So let us suppose I have 2 grains, gamma 1 and gamma 2. Okay. Now nucleation can happen any of these 2 phases. It does not matter that it has to be starting with alpha or Fe3C. Normally with the steels having carbon concentration less than about 0.8%, alpha is easy to nucleate, and on the other hand carbon concentration more than about 0.8, Fe3C is easy to nucleate. But this is in general. You can always have nucleation of alpha or Fe3C irrespective of the steel carbon concentration in the steel. So let us suppose I have a clean gain boundary like this between 2 gamma grains, and first phase to nucleate is a cementite. Okay. So I just put a cementite nucleus, and obviously when the cementite nucleates on this boundary, it will try to keep one of these interfaces as a coherent, so that this boundary has a low energy. On the other hand, other interface will be incoherent. So with the grain gamma 2, it has an incoherent boundary or semi-coherent boundaries, On the other hand, with the grain gamma 1, it has its covalent boundaries. That means this nucleus will have a specific orientation relationship with the grains on left side, on the right side, and these relationships are there in the books. Let us now discuss about the complex crystallography, but these are described by various scientists. They are known as KJ relationship. Okay. Now, once it nucleates, then it will grow into the gamma 2 grain, because it has an incoherent or semi-coherent interface with the gamma 2 grain, keeping this interface with the gamma 1 constant or same. So, as it grows, because this is carbon rich, it has about 6.678% carbon, this growth of it require more carbon. Remember, the carbon in these grains will not be as high as 6.67. Normally, the carbon will be varying from 0.2 to 1% of carbon. So, therefore, from different parts of this grain, carbon will diffuse interstitially and reach this cementite nucleus, and because of that, cementite nucleus will grow, okay, like this. So, once the cementite grows, the carbon concentration nearby the cementite will be very low, because the carbon will diffuse to the cementite, because total carbon concentration is fixed in the grain. So, therefore, if somewhere you have high carbon concentration, nearby regions will have low carbon concentration. This will lead to depletion of the carbon in the nearby regions on the both sides of these and in front of these also. So, therefore, this is the ideal situation for the nucleation of the alpha, and that is why alpha nucleates on the both sides of the cementite and it grows, correct. That is what will happen. Now, alpha is almost like a pure iron. It has very little amount of carbon, as I said you. Because it has very little amount of carbon, so obviously its growth requires rejection of carbon into the nearby, in this grain, nearby regions of these gamma 2 grain. So, because of that, again carbon concentration will be increasing on the both sides as well as in front of these alpha grains, okay. The alpha phase, this is alpha and this is cementite. Let us write it down, otherwise colors are like this. So, because of that, the carbon concentration on both sides and in front of the alpha will be more or increasing, and this will lead to basically nucleation of these cementite on the both sides again, and that is how these colonies forms, as I discussed in the last class. This is similar to eutectic transformation from the liquid. Exactly similar thing happens when lamellar eutectic forms. So, this will lead to a colony, and this colony will slowly grow into the gamma grain, and these colonies will appear on many places, here or there or there or like that, and that is what you have seen in the microstructure. These are the grains of the perlite. Remember, each of these actually consisting of both the phases cementite and alpha. So, that is the way transformation happens. So, the basic important aspect here is that the most important thing which control this transformation is the carbon diffusion. As you know, carbon is interstitial species because it is a small size atom. In BCC iron it goes into octal side, at FCC it goes to tetrahedral side. So, therefore, diffusion of carbon is relatively faster at the temperature below 727 degrees Celsius temperature, and that is why these transformations are relatively faster as compared to the other transformation in the solid solution based alloys. So, it is very clear the carbon which is diffusing along this boundary, basically obviously carbon is diffusing like this from alpha to P3, and also from the major part of the gamma grade in front of it to the P3C. So, that means the lateral diffusion of carbon is what is basically playing the role. So, if I have to draw it properly, if I draw it here, the whole thing, lateral diffusion of carbon, if I draw, these are the cementite lamellae, and in between if I draw the alpha lamellae, okay. So, this is alpha and this is also alpha, and these are the cementite. So, the diffusion of carbon like this, lateral sides, also diffusion of carbon from the front to this also important, because there is a gamma grain, remember this is gamma 2, right. So, that is the most important aspect. So, therefore, the growth rate V must be related to diffusivity of carbon in the gamma Rn, that must be, because this is what plays the important role, very clear. What else can determine the growth rate? Obviously, the first thing which will determine the growth rate is the undercooling. Undercooling of, remember this reaction normally should start at 727 degrees Celsius temperature, but it will never start. Why? Because the free energy available to drive this reaction will be 0 at the reaction temperature, that we know. At any reaction temperature, the free energy difference between gamma and the phase mixture of alpha and Fe3C is basically 0. So, therefore, it cannot start. So, to start the reaction we need to undercool it. So, if I draw the relevant part of the phase diagram here, just look carefully, this is temperature, this is weight percent carbon, right, and I am not going to the full diagram, that is 0 to 6.67% carbon, this corresponds to Fe3C, this corresponds to Fe3C. So, if I draw only the relevant portion of the phase diagram, this is what the relevant portion. So, this is alpha, remember these points correspond to 0.02 and this temperature is 727 degrees Celsius. This is gamma plus Fe3C and this is alpha plus gamma and this is alpha plus Fe3C. So, obviously, when you cool down the gamma phase below 727 degrees temperature, to start the transformation we need to undercool. We need to undercool by certain amount. Let us say this undercooling is about delta T. So, therefore, if I clearly see that the concentration of the alpha, metastable concentration of alpha and the Fe3C will be given by these 2 points. If we extend these lines, we will get that. So, it is clear that this level of undercooling will provide both the nucleation and the growth driving force. And it has been seen that in actual experiments that V, the growth velocity V actually is proportional to delta T square. The higher the undercooling, higher is the driving force available. But in solid state reactions, achievable undercooling can never be extremely high. Achievable undercooling will be something like couple of few degrees, it is not more than that. Why? Because this nucleation is heterogeneous here, and because nucleation is heterogeneous, so therefore undercooling achievable is very low, unlike in other cases. So, that is one of the problem. Therefore, the achievable undercooling is not very high in these cases. So, therefore, one can write down the velocity of this thing of the perlite the colony is basically K multiplied by delta T square into d C gamma, where K is a constant, proportionally constant, that depends on nature of the grain boundaries, nature of the site where the nucleation and growth happens, and many other things, the orientation relationships. So, as you see here, these two are the most critical aspects which determine the growth rate of the perlite, and they have a strong role to play in the growth of perlite. That is the one important aspect which you must remember that. But not only that, it is very clear that these, other than these factors, there may be other factors which will also play a role. Other factors like whether these perlites can start inside a grain boundary again, or it can start at the boundary, or it can start at the edge, will also play a role. It is very easy if the perlite nucleates at the grain boundary, so that it can grow easily into another grains. But suppose if a perlite starts growing inside a grain, then it is much slower. Even if the carbon supply is very high, still the growth will be very slow, because it has to grow from inside a grain. So, therefore, nucleation requires larger undercooling. Nucleation will take away a large part of the undercooling. So, available undercooling for the growth will be much lower. That is another problem. So, considerably nucleations, majority whatever has been observed in the literature does happen on the grain boundaries. That is one of the advantage of these solid state reactions. So, it is very clear that diffusivity of carbon in gamma at a temperature close to about 700 degree is quite high compared to others. So, that actually makes the pyrolytic growth very fast. In fact, its growth rate should be couple of hundreds of micron per seconds. That is what has been observed, and this allows us to actually discuss further, much further. So, as it is very clear that growth actually depends on diffusion of carbon. Now, suppose if I take the steel with a gamma structure, gamma iron structure, and quench it directly into water. So, the simple corollary of this equation is that as you quench from the high temperature to low temperature, high temperature room temperature directly, the diffusion of carbon will not happen. Why? Because diffusion requires certain time. Although diffusivities are higher per carbon in the gamma grains, but still it requires a finite time, and if we do not provide that finite time at a higher temperatures close to 700 degrees Celsius temperature, these transformation will not happen. This transformation is bound not to happen because primarily because even if the nucleation of perlite or nucleation of any of the grains happens, either alpha or cementite, they cannot grow because growth requires diffusion of carbon. That if that is not allowed, these colonies will never form. And this is the reason, so when you quench a steel, all of you have heard that this is very simple, very general term, that if you quench a steel from high temperature, something like 900 degrees Celsius temperature, you will form a new phase called martensites, not perlite. And that transformation is actually does not depend on diffusion of carbon. So, that is why the transformation happens when you quench a steel. That is the one important aspect. You have to be, it is very clear from looking at the pyrolytic transformations that if I quench a steel from high temperature to room temperature by dropping in water or ice or whatever, any media, this pyrolytic transformation is not going to happen, very clear, because it requires diffusion of carbon. Okay, so first thing which will be bifurcating, from these transformations is martensite. I told you, martensite is the first thing which we can see to happen if I quench a steel from 900 to room temperature. Simply you quench the steel, it will lead to formation of martensite. Okay, that is another way of looking at transforming gamma to some other product, is that if I take the steel from 900 degrees Celsius temperature, quench into a oil bath, let us say quench to about 400 degrees Celsius temperature. It can be a oil bath or it can be some substance like some glass which can melt at about 400 degrees Celsius temperature. So, if it is quenched and then it is kept there for a long time, perlite will not also form. Why? Because at a lower temperature, when it cools down to 400 or 350 degrees Celsius temperature, the diffusion of carbon is very slow. It is obvious because iron has a melting temperature of 1539 degrees Celsius temperature, and 350 is very low as compared to the melting temperature, because all diffusivity is actually scaled with melting temperature. So, therefore, at a lower temperature, diffusion, although carbon is an interstitial species, still diffusion will happen very slowly. This is a very generic thing, happens even in steel also. So, if you do that, if I quench to 400 degrees Celsius temperature, we can also stop the pyrolytic reaction, because this requires diffusion of carbon. And then further keeping the steel at lower temperature, at 400 degrees Celsius temperature for a long time, will lead to a new product known as bainite, again by the name of a famous scientist, E.C. Brain, who described the martensitic transformation. So, we can have actually three products, as you see here, starting from gamma. If I start with gamma, I can have three products. One is simple perlite. If I cool it slowly, and if you cool it very fast you can have martensite, and if you cool it intermediately, that is if you quench to about 400 Celsius temperature, then you keep it long time at the temperature, you are going to form benites. So that is the biggest advantage of steels. Depending on the type of heat treatment processes, transformation products can be changed. So perlite obviously is a lamellar structure of such a kind of thing, cementite plus alpha iron. Martensite is a completely distinctly different product, it basically has a crystal structure of body center tetragonal. Benite is again a product consisting of both Fe alpha and Fe3C, but morphologically this is distinctly different from the perlite, they do not look like a lamellar structures. So I just wanted to tell you that these transformations indeed plays a very important role for the steel metallurgy, because depending on the type of transformation product, properties do change. Like martensite is very hard and extremely brittle, perlite and benite is relatively softer, perlite is basically much softer than benite. So therefore perlite and benite will have sufficient ductility, martensite will not have. So depending on whatever is our need, we can actually produce this kind of structures by starting with the gamma at the beginning. So martensites are very hard, therefore they can be used in different applications which requires which wire resistance and many other resistance. On the other hand, benite and perlite can be used in structural applications where you need certain amount of ductility. So depending on our need, we can change these phases and we can change the transformation products by simply doing a different types of heat treatments. So that is the first thing which actually comes as a corollary of the paralytic transformation, because paralytic transformation is the basis of all these things. Now the second important aspects of paralytic transformation is that this transformation actually can be controlled by, or the basically mechanical property of perlite can be controlled by controlling this interlamellar spacing. So let me just draw again. As you know, like eutectic, you have also interlamellar spacing between these grains, between these products actually, alpha and cementite. So we define, if this is alpha and these rest of the things are Fe3C. So we define these as a lambda, or one can define another way, we can define like this also, it does not matter. So is basically the width of the one alpha lamellae and one cementite lamellae, that is what is known as the interlamellar spacing. Similarly, you can also take from half of the alpha lamellae, center of the alpha lamellae to the center of the cementite lamellae, that is also defined as a lambda. So this lambda has a strong role in mechanical properties. Smaller lambda is better, okay. So actually you can control this lambda by controlling the heat treatment temperature. Suppose if I keep the reaction happening at very close to 700 Celsius temperature when undercooling is low, so this thickness of this lamella will be larger, okay, they will not be smaller, because at high temperature diffusion is very good, diffusion can happen faster, so these lamellae will be becoming fatter. But if you quench, if you actually have a, not quench, if you give a much higher undercooling, something like about, if you do the experiment at 650 to 680 degrees Celsius temperature, then this transformation will lead to very finer lamella. The interlamellar width will be much smaller, and because at lower temperature diffusion of carbon is slower. So by simply controlling this transformation temperature, we can control the diffusivity of carbon. As you see that V is proportional to B is equal to K delta T square multiplied by dC gamma. So dC gamma can be reduced extensively if you cool, if you actually do the experiments at a lower temperature like 650 or 680 degrees Celsius temperature. So therefore it gives us another handle to for us to control the mechanical properties of perlite. We can have fine perlite, coarse perlite, depending on at temperature at which we are doing the heat treatment. So that means we have empty number of choices, a large number of choices. You can have perlite, different types of lamellar, martensites, when you quench, benites, there are different types of benites also which we will discuss in the next lecture. So we can actually create large number of microstructure by simply changing our heat treatment conditions. The understanding phase transformation allows you to do that. That is the advantage of the phase transformation in the steel. So, therefore, we are going to take up these cases, martensites and the banites separately, and finally we will bring all the transformation together to show you that for a person who is working in industry, how we can control these reactions by simply controlling the heat treatment temperature and the time scale.